Are you there? The program starts in just a few minutes. All right, greetings. It's 4 o'clock, and that means it's time for us to start our weekly seminar. The topic this week is gun usage in the US for justice and not terror. And what we're going to be talking about is the history of the African liberation movement. And as that's taught to us, if you can call it that, taught, is that the movement has used nonviolence as a principle in the movement. So whether you're talking about the African liberation movements, the civil rights, Black Power movements in the US, the Caribbean, Canada, and Europe, the way it's presented to us is that these movements always used nonviolence as a principle, meaning by principle that that was the only method that was used to struggle, and anything else or any suggestion of anything else is the epitome of absurdity. And so the purpose of today's session is to debunk that myth and to clarify that the African liberation struggle, like any liberation struggle anywhere in human society, is, as Malcolm X said, the people engaging in those struggles always have the right to achieve justice by any means necessary. So we're going to talk about that in a historical context to establish today, what exists today and how we can move forward today. So that's what the discussion is going to be about. And as always, we always start by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. These are the people whose are the rightful caretakers of these lands in the Americas, or what the Western Hemisphere, or whatever you want to call it, the North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. They are the natural inhabitants of that. Anyone else that's here is either the descendants of settlers or people who were enslaved, the Africans who were brought through the Middle Passage. So we acknowledge the indigenous people for allowing us to set foot here for 500 plus years. We ask them their patience as we continue to engage in the work to liberate Africa so that we will have the opportunity to meet our needs there for those of us who choose to do that. And those of us who choose to continue to stay here will work in conjunction to respecting, honoring, and contributing to an indigenous society of the Western Hemisphere. We also acknowledge our African ancestors who, contrary to the lies being told, fought our kidnapping from the very East African shores to all the way to the Western shores of the Western Hemisphere here in the United Snakes and up and down the Western Shore. We fought resiliently, we fought defiantly, and we continue to fight. And if you're African today and you have a fighting spirit, you need to understand that's where you got it from, our ancestors. So when they're telling you that our ancestors in Africa and in the Middle Passage didn't fight, then you know that that's not true, because the spirit you have inherited from the righteous and legitimate struggle that's been waged for hundreds of years. And so with that, we will go ahead and begin. Just some quick housekeeping. Everybody who decides to join us through Zoom will be muted. You will not have the ability to unmute. Unfortunately, we live in a society where people, instead of engaging in principled ideological struggle, want to be disruptive and engage in tactics like that to prevent you from spreading your message. So we have it set up that way to mitigate the possibility of that happening. We are inviting you to write comments or questions in the chat section on Zoom, and we'll get to them. And then people on Facebook as well, whatever comments and questions you have, those are being monitored, and we'll get to them throughout this hour. And so with that, we'll go ahead and start and just say, we have to always acknowledge when we do these every week that we're not just two people on here, Shakur and I, who are just voicing our independent opinions. This event is sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I've been a longtime organizer for the AAPRP on 3 continents in the Caribbean. Shakur grew up within the AAPRP and is a strong supporter of the AAPRP's work as well. And so understanding what the All African People's Revolutionary Party, or the AAPRP, is, We are a mass, independent, revolutionary, Pan-African political party based in Africa. Our objective is Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa. That's the work that we're engaged in. And as a result of that work, we have chapters all over the African world. And if you want an idea for what that work looks like, then I would suggest if you look to the left there, the small picture is the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, written by Kwame Nkrumah in Guinea-Conakry, West Africa in 1968. And that book serves as the strategic guide for our fight to build Pan-Africanism on a worldwide basis. And our way of doing that, as articulated in this handbook, is to unite African revolutionary forces on the ground everywhere in Africa into one unified fighting organism. So if you want an example of what that looks like, in 2 weeks, we will host a virtual International African Liberation Day, as the poster on the left demonstrates. And on that webcast event, which, as you can see, starts at 3:30 UTC time, so you'll have to translate what that is based on where in the world you are as to when it starts. I know out here it's 8:30 in the morning, and it'll be a 3-hour program. But in that program, we will have participants from Zimbabwe, Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, Azania, or what you would call South Africa, Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria. And so this is a reflection of the work that I'm talking to you about that we're engaged in to build this worldwide fighting force for Pan-Africanism. And we'll give you this poster again at the end so that you can see how you can participate in African Liberation Day. But another thing that the APRP does is we engage in principled relationships with many different liberation movements. We don't see the struggle as a struggle in a vacuum. So, for instance, we have strong ties to the Filipino National Liberation Movement, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, the Irish Republican National Liberation Movement, as well as, of course, as I mentioned, the struggles of the indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere. And when we say that, we're not saying we just support them in terms of them being on the reservation and gaining treaty rights. We say this is their land and they need to get their land back. And we intend to do everything we can to help them do that. Obviously, the best thing we can do is liberate our mother Africa, because without Africa, Western imperialism is weak and exposed on its knees. Without the ability to exploit the human and material resources of Africa and her children, imperialism is severely weakened. So that makes it that much easier for the indigenous people and all of those other liberation movements I mentioned who are fighting the same enemies we are to fight back. So we just ask you to pay attention to our theme for African Liberation Day, displayed on the left. Imperialist sanctions on Zimbabwe, Cuba, Venezuela are acts of war. And I forgot to mention, we'll also have representatives from Venezuela and Cuba, official government representatives, during this African Liberation Day program. You will never see that on CNN, CBS, or CIA network. So you should definitely tune in to this webinar. And then finally, just for me, I'm a prolific blogger and author. I'll give you the blog site when we get through. And then again, Shakura, my amazing daughter, is studying for her PhD at the University of Memphis, Tennessee, Communications and Public Health. And so she and I are going to conduct this seminar, as we will be doing weekly together. She has grown into a strong and committed activist on her own as it relates specifically to women's health issues under capitalism and how to address that. And I've had the privilege, honor to participate with her in many of her activities where she lives. So I'm actually going to turn it over to her right now, and she's going to kick off our discussion on this important seminar topic.
Okay, sorry. Thank you so much. I hope everyone is doing well. So first and foremost, I want us to just think about how guns are essential in terms of the killing of indigenous populations. So that means terrorizing and killing them, which was reducing of their numbers and eventually subjugating them to life on the reservations. As we think about that, it's also important for us to consider that guns were central to the kidnapping of millions of Africans as well. And so because of that, the result was the forced enslavement of those African people and terrorizing them for hundreds of years. Third, I want to bring to your attention that this statistic is very powerful and that today there are approximately 100 guns to every person that is circulating throughout the United States. Just take a moment and think about that. Approximately 100 guns to every person circulating throughout the United States. And last but not least, gun culture in the United States is equal to the systems of oppression because guns are symbolic of the systems of oppression that dominate people in this society. So it's very difficult to think of one and not the other. That's why the slide is suggesting gun culture is equal to toxic patriarchy because it's all built in with maintaining that same system of oppression. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we think about the Second Amendment and who I should say it was created for, the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution was written largely to protect anti-African slave militias from the Southern United States. It is very important to consider that guns are prevalent to protect European Judeo-Christian society from the Indians and the Africans. And then finally, I want us to kind of think about, so if we're thinking about the four statements I made in the previous slide and then the two that I just stated, the result, the end game or the outcome of that would be guns plus capitalistic institutions and European people equals the safety of freedom. And the contrary to that would be guns plus oppressed people equals crime and destruction. Or so that's what we're socialized to think, and that's what we're socialized and conditioned to learn.
Thank you, Shakura. So continuing on, just changing the narrative a bit and talking about guns as tools for liberation and just asking everybody to just open your mind and think about it like that for a minute, because we are revolutionaries. So we are dialectical and historical materialists. So what that means is that we recognize that every entity in the universe occupies space and holds weight. That's what material is. That's the definition of material, something that occupies space and holds weight. And so everything in the universe is defined by that definition. And so all of those things that exist in the universe, each and everything, if you take a look around wherever you are right now, you see material objects. Each of those things has a mass within it. And within that mass, there are molecules, and those molecules are in the process of destruction. What that means is that if you're looking at a tree or a chair or a table or a bicycle or a computer or a cell phone or whatever you're looking at right now, or food, if you return to this location 1,000 years from now, whatever you're looking at will not hold the same material space in the same way that it does right now, because it will have deteriorated. So the process of deterioration is the breaking down of those molecules, and that process, we say, is a question of positive forces fighting against negative forces. And everything in the universe has that principle applied to it. So what that means is that everything has good and bad. Some things are 90% good, 10% bad. Some are 90% bad, 10% good. Some are 50-50, some are 30-70, but everything has good and bad. And the struggle, the dialectical part, is the struggle to make the good dominant. So you cannot take something like guns and say, well, guns are just bad. There's just no way around it. They're just bad. Because that would not be true. Historically, there have been many examples where guns have served to help advance justice and civilization. If guns are in the hands of people who have the right ideas and objectives in their hands, then guns are a necessary element. But this system of imperialism wants oppressed people to believe that there's no way ever that we can justifiably see guns as a positive force. We have to always look at guns as a negative. Even though they use guns against us every day, we are programmed to always see guns as a negative. No discussion, and anyone proposing otherwise is insane. That's the training we all basically get. So what we want to do today is just do our best to debunk that and just give you some clear examples of liberation struggles that were not carried out with a principle of nonviolence, that were effective and positive influences and manifestations in our history. So the first example, if you look at the picture on the top left, that's of the land and freedom movement, or what's more commonly known as the Mau Mau movement in Kenya, that took place in the late 50s and the early 70s with people like Dedan Kimathi and Fred Batau and many others of all genders. And this independence movement was designed to facilitate a struggle with Britain to bring about independence in Kenya. And although that struggle was being waged on the legislative front and on the diplomatic front, what the Land and Freedom Movement did, or the Mau Mau did, is they took to the countryside and they began to attack the settlers who were there from Britain. And it was really their struggle, which waged on for almost 10 years, where they were able to effectively beat militarily hundreds of European outposts. That struggle was a central part of forcing the British into a position where they had to succumb to independence for Kenya. So the Mau Mau movement, or the Land and Freedom Movement, was an essential part of bringing independence to that region of the world, that country. And they did not do that through nonviolence. They did that through direct warfare with the colonizers. Another example to the right, the picture of Robert and Mabel Williams, his wife. And so Robert Williams was the president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP chapter in Monroe, North Carolina in the mid-50s. And because of the oppressive conditions against African people there, where the Ku Klux Klan, which was often the police during the day and put on the sheet and be the Klan at night, which is still the case today, what happened there is that the NAACP, under Robert Williams' leadership, they decided to arm themselves and to call for African people in Monroe, North Carolina to arm themselves. And by doing that, they were almost practically dismembered from the national NAACP. But what happened is that as the African community began to rally and try to defend itself there was a European couple who was riding in a car through the African community when there was somewhat of a urban uprising taking place in Monroe. And Robert and Mabel Williams welcomed the couple into their house for the couple's safety. And the police there, wanting to get rid of Robert Williams, accused him of kidnapping the couple. And to avoid what would have certainly been a lynching, Robert escaped and fled to Cuba. And then he went on to China, and he stayed there until he came back here in the mid-1990s before he passed on. And Mabel Williams passed on just a couple of years ago. But Robert and Mabel Williams are recognized, along with Malcolm X, as the faces of the modern militant Black Power movement and the philosophy that we should organize by any means necessary to secure our freedom. The picture in the middle left is of Charles Sims. And what he's doing is he's tearing up a Ku Klux Klan hood. And this rally is taking place in Bogalusa, Louisiana in 1964. It's the place where the Deacons for Defense, which is Charles Sims' organization, where that was found. The purpose of the Deacons of Defense was to protect civil rights workers who were engaged in nonviolent action. But because the police could not be depended upon, again, many of the police were Klan members themselves. And so since they were never to be depended upon to adequately protect the people, the Deacons for Defense formed, and most of them were former war veterans. And their philosophy was, if we're gonna pick up arms and fight for the United Snakes against other countries, then we certainly are gonna pick up arms here and fight for our rights as human beings in this country against the United Snakes. So that's what the Deacons did. And although there have been so many attempts to write them out of history, like none of these civil rights movies that you see include the Deacons for Defense. You don't see nary a hair of the Deacons in the Selma movie or any of those movies. And that's not an accident, that's certainly by design. But the reality and truth is that the Deacons for Defense are one of the primary reasons why there was not more violence committed against civil rights workers during the civil rights movement because of their presence. That was documented a number of times. In fact, there is a joke that goes around with people who were involved in the civil rights movement, because the brother pictured in there, in this picture here, Charles Sims, he was the personal bodyguard for Dr. Martin Luther King. And Charles Sims was a convicted felon. He was known for brawling and fighting. He carried a .45 semi-automatic pistol. Everybody knew that, including Dr. King and the people in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the joke was that even though the public face, or as you know, Dr. King, was that he was principally in favor of nonviolence, the joke was that whenever Dr. King got ready to go somewhere during the period of 1964, 65, 66, he would first look around to see where Charles Sims was before he would leave. He would want to leave. And that was a joke in the movement. The people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee would always joke with Dr. King about that. That, yeah, you're for nonviolence, but you're always looking for brothers Charles Sims before you'll make a move. And Dr. King would say, yes, I am. I'm not going anywhere without Charles Sims. So this is a part of the history that we have to understand, because Dr. King was an important part of that history, but so was Charles Sims with that .45 automatic pistol. And then the picture on the right is the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which organized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Alabama in 65, 66, engaged in an effort to bring about political power for the African community there in Lowndes County, which was so brutally oppressed by Ku Klux Klan and police violence that the nickname for that county was Bloody Lowndes for that time. Because if you wanted to register to vote and you were African, you could count on your house being shot up, your house being set on fire, assassination attempts being carried out against you. So to combat that, SNCC helped organize the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, and they decided that they would be armed to protect themselves in their political organizing activities. And since the majority of people in Lowndes County couldn't read, they became known for their symbol, the Black Panther Party. And if you know the history, whenever SNCC had assignments and work that they did, they made a call for young people, primarily college students, to come from all over the country and come in and participate in their work. And so college students did that. And one young college student that came, they weren't just college students, a lot of people came, like the European woman, Viola Liuzzo, who was murdered in her car. She was a Detroit housewife who heeded the call of SNCC and drove down. She said, I have a car, I can help with that. So she took her car and she drove down there, and her goal was to drive civil rights workers around, and the Ku Klux Klan followed her and shot into her car and killed her. And there was an undercover FBI agent in that car, a Ku Klux Klansman. And so people responded to SNCC that way. And so one of the people that did that was a young man from Oakland, California, named Mark Comfort. He was a community activist in Oakland at that time in the mid-60s. And he was also a friend of Huey P. Newton. And so once he came to Lowndes County and saw the Black Panther Party, or the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, he went back to Oakland and he told Huey P. Newton, there's some Black people in Alabama, they're organizing the Black Panther Party and they got guns. And so this is what gave Huey Newton the idea to start the Black Panther Party for self-defense that most of you are aware of. And if you want documentation of that, you can find it in Huey Newton's autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, where he talks about, he wrote Kwame Ture, who was in Stokely Carmichael and was the chairperson of SNCC, and asked him for permission to use the name Black Panther Party. And Kwame Ture documents that as well in his autobiography, Revolution. For some reason, I can't think of the name of it, but Kwame Ture's autobiography, he documents it as well. And so the last picture on the bottom is critical. And I just want to take a couple of seconds to talk about it, because this is history that most people just have no idea about. But this picture you're looking at is a picture of Ernesto Che Guevara on the left, holding the baby, and then one of the fighters for the National Congolese Movement on the right. And this picture was taken in the rural bush area of the Congo in 1964. And so if you don't know the history, Che Guevara went to the Congo in 1964 to help bolster the National Congolese Movement, which was being was under assault from imperialist sources who had 3 years before that assassinated the democratically elected leader of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, and did that because they wanted to ensure the continued exploitation of Congolese natural and human resources by multinational corporations. If you don't know, the rare earth minerals used to provide the capacity for us to communicate right now come from the Congo. And so the Congolese people under the National Congolese Movement wanted to facilitate those resources being used for the Congolese people and for Africa, as they should. And imperialism wanted to ensure that those resources continued to be strictly under the control of multinational capitalist corporations like Apple, like Samsung, like Motorola, like they are today. And so they assassinated Lumumba and they engaged in a systemic effort to wipe out the National Congolese Movement. So to challenge that, Cuba, socialist Cuba, sent Che Guevara and 100 combatants to the Congo to support, help train, and fight with the National Congolese Movement. So this is essential because even though Che and the combatants from Cuba and the National Congolese Movement were not successful, and the right-wing forces led by the Central Intelligence Agency, or Criminals in Action as we call them, installed Mobutu Sese Seko as the dictator in the Congo, and he stayed in that position for decades. So Che and the National Congolese Movement were not successful in their effort, but what that did establish was Cuba's revolutionary and military presence in Africa. Che's work there established that. And so after even the failed mission with the in the Congo, Cuba assigned Brother Victor Drake Cruz to be Cuba's military commander to assist African liberation efforts throughout Africa. And it was through those efforts that the Cubans assisted the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau, the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, fight for their independence through warfare from the Portuguese. The Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the MPLA in Angola, did the same from the Portuguese. And Frelimo, the national movement for independence in Mozambique, was able to do the same by fighting warfare against the Portuguese. The Portuguese colonized all three of those countries. And so it was Cuba that played a central role in providing weapons, training people, and providing the support to ensure those liberation movements were successful. But probably the most unknown and most critical element that these ties that Che Guevara established were able to implement in Southern Africa was Cuba's role in militarily assisting the Angolan independence movement, the Zimbabwe independence movement, the anti-apartheid movement in Tanzania, or what you call South Africa, the movement for independence in Namibia. So in the 1980s and early 90s, the small socialist country of Cuba, 11 million people, during that period of about 8 or 9 years, they sent 500,000 troops to Southern Africa to fight. Who were they fighting? They were fighting the apartheid-led elements in Tanzania, South Africa, who, with the help of European mercenaries, many of them who were war criminals from Nazi Germany, their effort was to make all of Southern Africa under racist apartheid. That was their objective, their publicly stated objective. You can research it and find it out for yourself. Don't take my word for it. That was what they wanted to do. They wanted to turn the entire region of Southern Africa into the same racist apartheid regime that Tanzania was at that time, where African people had to walk around with passbooks and were limited in where they could go and were imprisoned for even stepping out of the boundaries of the neighborhoods that were established, the townships that were established for them, and were terrorized on a day-to-day basis. They wanted to make that the reality for first all of Southern Africa and eventually all of Africa, so that they could have free reign to exploit human and material resources. And you have to understand, your United Snakes government was a main ally in that process. To the bitter end, they were allies to the racist apartheid regime in Azania and South Africa. It could not have engaged in this work without the support of this government, the United States. I don't care whether it's the Democratic or Republican Party, they all supported it. There's no question about that. They all supported it. From the Kennedy Democratic regime in the early 60s, all the way up through the Bush regime in the early 90s, the Republican regime, they all supported it. And so the Cubans, by sending those 500,000 troops, they were the X factor. They were the X factor that was able to tip the scales in favor of the forces of justice. And because of their presence and their willingness to fight and die, they lost about 40,000 people in Southern Africa during that region through these wars. They were able to force the end of colonialism, help force the end of colonialism in Angola, to help win the independence of Namibia. And the negotiated settlement that allowed Nelson Mandela, the leader of the African National Congress, to walk out of Robben Island prison in Azania, South Africa in 1990 happened because of the negotiation that in order for him to be released, the Cuban troops would have to leave Southern Africa. So all of those things, the independence of Namibia, Angola, Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe, the release of Nelson Mandela, and then the eventual fall of racist apartheid in Azania, South Africa, just 4 years after that, all of that in large part has to do with the heroic military effort of the Cubans, who again sent 500,000 troops, as well as the Angolans and Mozambique, folks from Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and all of those people who they didn't negotiate this, you all. This was accomplished through armed struggle, no question about that. And Cuba received nothing for their participation in that. They don't get like you get in the U.S. military. They didn't get home loan points and free admission to college. You didn't have to bribe them to fight because they're fighting for justice. You got to bribe people to fight for this country because they're sending them to fight in countries they have no business going to. They have no business fighting. So they got to bribe people to convince people to want to do it. They don't have to do that when you're fighting for justice. You don't have to do that. You just tell people there's a need for us to fight for liberation, and people volunteer. All those 500,000 troops volunteered. All of those people fighting from Angola volunteered. All of those people fighting from Mozambique and Zimbabwe volunteered. Everybody in the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the Azanian People's Organization in Azania, they volunteered to fight. So that's a critical thing. So 2 points from that. Like we're not trying to hear anybody telling us, well, nonviolence is the only thing that will work. If it wasn't for our ability to organize and fight militarily, all of Southern Africa, at least today, would be under apartheid rule. And the other point is that we don't want to hear anything you have to say negatively about the Cuban Socialist Revolution, Fidel Castro, or Che Guevara. They're heroes to us. They're people who fought, and they were the ones who were able to engage that struggle. They were the ones who were able to gauge that struggle so that we were able to effectively move forward in that part of the world. So it was their ability as military commanders that helped facilitate that process. There's no question about that. So understand that. So the next point on that, we've given, some clear analysis as to how guns have certainly helped our liberation struggle. The next analysis is that, there's just no possible way you can give me an example of people who have won their freedom without taking it. Like nobody, the imperialists have killed millions of people, y'all. And they continue to do that today as we're speaking right now. These people will never relinquish power just because it's the right thing to do. The only way that we will ever gain power is we have to organize and we have to take it back. So that's just a universal principle of life that we have to accept. And unfortunately, the ability to organize around utilizing a military approach is a part of that process. There is no way around that because the people that we're dealing with are not going to relinquish their exploitative role just because it's time for them to do that or just because it's the right thing to do. They have demonstrated that they will destroy the planet before they relinquish that. So the only way we can ever, expect to stop them is if we are prepared to organize and fight them on all levels. I wish there was another way around that, but unfortunately, there is no way around that. We have to be willing to do that. But that being said, you know, and again, as Malcolm X said, you know, we have to be willing to do that by any means necessary. But that being said, this military organization cannot exist unless it's a part of a political education program. In fact, the political education program has to drive the military program. So nobody can leave here and say, well, that All African People's Revolutionary Party, they say they want to give everybody guns and they want everybody to go out and shoot white people. No, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that in order for people to be free, we're going to have to be willing to fight back. And that is going to have to be guided by our understanding of the forces that impact us in this world and how we navigate through those forces. And that, as Che Guevara said, our incentive has to be guided by a position of love. It has to be guided by love for justice and humanity. And so when we get to the military phase, that's an unfortunate phase, but it has to be guided by love. And so that's why if you study the Cuban Revolution, they started with 11 people because the story is the grandma's ship sank. And so a lot of the people died who, you know, were launched to try to wage the guerrilla war in Cuba in the Sierra Maestras, the mountains above Santiago de Cuba in 1957, 58. So they only had 11 people to start. Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Juan Almeida, the African, Che Guevara, and a few other people. But they had the organized resistance led by people like Vilma Espin, who was Raul Castro's longtime wife. She just passed away a short time ago, respect. Celia Sanchez, Robert Massetti, Frank Pass, all of these people in Cuba who led the urban resistance. They organized mass strikes in Cuba, and that supported the guerrilla campaign. But the guerrilla campaign in the mountains, when they captured the military people, they didn't execute them. They didn't torture them. They sat them down and they explained to them what they were doing and why they were fighting for a revolution and why it was in the interest. Most of these military people were peasantry, and why it was in their interest to join the revolution and not fight for the military against the revolution. And the way they bolstered their troops was by, their guerrillas rather, was by engaging in that political education method. So it was the political education, not just the guns, that eventually led to their victory. So that's an important thing to understand. Political education guides military. Anybody telling you that you just need to get some guns and you don't have any strong political education guiding that, that's the police. That's the police guiding you in that direction. All right, so political education and guns. And here on the left, we have a picture of one of the work study circles meeting for the All African People's Revolutionary Party on the University of Legon college campus in Ghana. And I've actually been there multiple times and participated in work study circle groups there at that very same location. They're literally the very same location. I've gone there and done that. So we talk all the time about political education, but from here forward, we're going to start giving you some real concrete examples so people can understand exactly what it is. So when we say political education, that's not the same thing as just individuals reading books. It's great for individuals to read books. We want people to read. That's certainly a good thing. I rode my bike down to the river yesterday and people were walking by and I'm reading this book that I have, fascinating book, We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World by Helen Jaffe. It's an outstanding book that debunks all of the myths about Cuba that come out in the capitalist media. So I'm reading this book and I cannot tell you how many people literally stopped in their tracks to stare at me reading this book. Why? Because number one, people aren't used to seeing people reading big volume books. If you think about it, how often do you see that in society? Even before these lockdowns, you still didn't see it. It's just not something that happens. People are looking at their phones, but people are not reading large volume books. And then secondly, people they don't envision an African doing that kind of reading. So it shocks people, so they stop and stare. I understand, I'm not offended by it, but it just tells me that this is more ammunition to justify that we need to push for more and more political education. So when we say political education, we're talking about a process like what you see in this picture, where people come together and engage in comprehensive study around concepts, where you have that done in an organized process. So you have a book list. We have a book list in the APRP. We actually have 3 different book lists. But for people who say, hey, I'm interested in, I want to participate in a work study process, then you start on our first book list and you study materials, and we ask you to read, because again, people don't generally do that. So reading is a challenge for people. So we ask people to study, not just skim through read, but study. And what that means is you meet every 2 weeks for a couple of hours, and you read 70 pages every 2 weeks. And you know, if that's a challenge for you, then you start by reading 5 pages a day, just 5 pages a day. It'll take you no more than 15, 20 minutes. And the more you do that, the more you'll find you'll want to read more than 5 pages a day, because you'll get faster, your comprehension will grow. You get a dictionary by you. At first, you'll need that to interpret some of what does imperialism mean? What does neocolonialism mean? You know, what are all these, what does dialectical historical materialism mean? What does all this stuff mean? So you'll need to do that at first, but eventually you'll gain a comfortable understanding of all those words, and you won't need that dictionary, and you'll read faster, and you'll read faster than that. But at first, 5 pages a day, 70 pages every 2 weeks. Then you meet every 2 weeks, like you see here, and you discuss what you're reading. And what that process will do for you is it'll give you strong skills in facilitation, strong skills in comprehension, strong skills in the ability to interpret material and articulate it. And hopefully, more important than all those things, it'll give you a desire to want to implement what you're learning into your day-to-day life practices. That's the idea behind it. And so not only would it help, not only does work study help the people in the APRP, but for me, I participated in this process 36 years. And so I have a master's degree that I earned from the bourgeois university. But what I've learned in the APRP work study process, it circles around what I learned in the bourgeois institution 20 times. In fact, so if you ask me, even though I got a degree, these degrees in economics and political science, you ask me a question about any of those things or any assignment I'm working on in relation to those things, my ability to answer is shaped mostly by my work in the APRP and what I've learned in this APRP work study circle. So actually what it did is it made college so much easier for me, because I already had a disciplined study process that I participated in. I was already engaging in that when I was an undergraduate, and I breezed through graduate school. You know, I have no problem doing that. So that's what it does for you. And then even what I do for a living now, I work for a labor union. And a lot of that is trainings and presentations. And again, this is stuff that I've learned in the party, so it's not difficult for me to do. So you'll gain all types of life skills, but this is the process that you have to engage in to get that. And that's what we mean by political education process. So the organized reading material, rotating facilitation, so everybody gets used to doing it. If you think that we do it decent enough for this, it's because we've been doing it and we learn how to do it. And you can too if you don't know how to do it. Everybody can do it. That's what collective leadership is about. And then studying, like I mentioned, the examples I gave, instead of just skimming through the materials. Like we're so used to just skimming through stuff that we don't even know the difference between skimming and studying. We think by skimming that we're studying. And you see that all the time, because a lot of people get their information through social media. And since I write a lot of articles, like on my blog, what I notice is that people will make comments about my blog articles, and they haven't even read the article. They just do that based on the title. You see that, I know you all know what I'm talking about. You see it all the time. That's the kind of society we live in now. It doesn't even require us to do any work. And people are so intellectually lazy, people don't want to do any work. They just want to be able to talk just because they have vocal cords. Well, what we're saying is that we think that we have a responsibility to do better than that. We have a responsibility to raise above that. And this process helps us do that, okay? And another critical component to the work study process, and this is why we don't believe that it's something that, you just do by reading books, is that we have in the APRP what we call criticism, self-criticism process. What is that? Well, what it is that we encourage participants to use criticism, self-criticism, not as a method to beat people up, not as a way to tear people down, but as a way to make us all stronger. So for example, in the work study process, you've read your 70 pages, you come to the meeting, you did 5 pages a day, you're really proud of that, and you're ready to meet, you're ready to talk about the material, you studied the questions, you're ready to participate in the discussion. Well, the person next to you, they didn't read. They showed up, that's good, but they didn't read. Maybe they skimmed through 5 pages or so, but they didn't really read it. So we use criticism to say, well, brother Ajamu or comrade Ajamu, why didn't you read? Well, I didn't have time. Okay, but what does that mean? You know, because 5 pages a day, you probably have time to do 5 pages a day. So what does that mean? Well, you know, really, like I'm having a hard time getting the book. Okay, so how can we talk about how we can help you do that? Okay, once I get the book, so what kind of study process do you have? Well, there's all these people, I got kids running in my house. So how can we talk through how we can set up 30 minutes a day or 20 minutes a day or whatever it takes for you to just step aside, step outside, whatever you have to do this reading. Maybe you can do it during your lunch break at work. How can we say, oh, okay, yeah, I could probably try to do that. Okay, well, you try that tomorrow. I'll check in with you, see how it went. And then we'll go to the next day. So that's the purpose of criticism, self-criticism, that example. So you use it to build people up. And so what that does is it makes it so that we're developing collectively and we're all committed to each other. So the minute you recognize a problem, you at that point forward have a responsibility to be a part of the solution to that problem. You can't just do like what people do in this capitalist society. Well, you didn't do that right. You didn't do that right. How come this didn't happen? Well, what was your role in it? You know, Huey P. Newton said, no participation, no right to observation. So what kind of backward society is it where people are totally comfortable criticizing something they've never participated in and have no idea what it takes to make it happen? But that's what you have here in this bourgeois society where whatever is in people's heads is just as valuable as other people's actual practical experience doing it. Well, with our work study process, we're trying to destroy that confusion because that keeps us from moving forward. And you all know what I'm talking about. If you just look at social media, look at the stuff people are talking about, and you know what I'm talking about. So this is a process designed to elevate us higher than that and take us higher. And so that's what we mean when we say political education, establishing and institutionalizing a process like that. And then if we do that, then we can start talking about adding components to that process. Once we know what colonialism is, once we know what capitalism is, once we know what Pan-Africanism is, what Marxist-Leninism is, what Nkrumah Toreism is, Maoism is, whatever approach you take, then we can start talking about, okay, let's have some classes on gun safety, how to disassemble guns, put them together, gun safety, how to handle a gun, how to do that, how to use it. Let's go through some drills in case somebody wants to oppress you. Some of these people, you know, I read this meme today. It said, why are white people going out running, jogging for Ahmaud Arbery, the brother who was killed by the bottom shoe scum in Georgia for jogging? And the meme said, why are people going out jogging for him? He didn't die jogging. He died trying to take a gun from a white supremacist that was trying to shoot him and kill him, and eventually did. So if you want to honor brother Ahmaud Arbery, then fight white supremacists. So I agree with that 100%. So after your PE process is in place, then you can start talking about gun training, preparation. All of that stuff is appropriate at that point, but it can't happen unless you have that strong political education, because you'll get a lot of people, they're excited by the guns, but they're not excited by the reading. And that's a problem. And history has proven that's a problem. If you don't believe that, as much as we love and respect the Black Panther Party, just study their history and you'll see the examples of how that's a problem. Little Bobby Hutton today is dead because of adventurism within the Black Panther Party by people like Eldridge Cleaver, adventurism. where they thought that a few people could attack the Oakland Police Department. That's nonsense. But that's what happens when you don't have the proper political education and organization. So that's what we need. So just want to close by again mentioning African Liberation Day on May 25th and inviting everybody to come out to that and participate. Obviously, it's virtual. It's 3 p.m. UTC, so you have to look at that. I know there's people here from Pacific time, Central time, Eastern time, people from Africa, like right, Africa is 7 hours ahead of Pacific time. Southern Africa is up to 9 hours ahead. So you have to know that Canada is 4 hours ahead of Pacific time. So understand that and participate. Imperialist sanctions on Zimbabwe, Cuba, and Venezuela are acts of war. And we have to organize a worldwide movement to stop this nonsense. And that's what African Liberation Day is about today. It's going to be streamed through all kinds of social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. So you'll have various opportunities to watch. And then the last thing, just want to say that we have a number of resources. If you want more information, we have a number of very excellent articles about COVID-19 in Africa and around the world, how it's impacting African people. You can find those. There are at least 3 or 4 articles recently posted on our international AAPRP website. So I encourage you to go there and check that out, AAPRP-intel.org, as well as information about what other countries like socialist Cuba are doing. They're working on a vaccine. I guarantee you they'll have it before you see anything like that here. I'll take bets for you on that, because their motivation is curing people, not just Cubans, but they're in 50 countries around the world treating people with their antiviral drug they created to combat HIV in the 1980s. And now they're trying to build on that with a vaccine. They're in 50 countries. And just like the 500,000 troops they sent to Southern Africa, they don't charge any money to send these people to 50 countries to treat people. They do it because they have the political education to understand their responsibility to the world. You don't have a vaccine here because somebody somewhere is trying to figure out how to patent it and make money off of it. So that's the civilized capitalist system way. So if you want information about what's going on to combat that, go to that APRP-intel.org site, and also under that, my blog site has similar articles. A lot of them are on the central site as well, talking about a lot of those things. I can't even remember now, but I think the last one I wrote was entitled "Stop Using Trump Incompetency to Romanticize Obama." So I know a lot of us, particularly us African people, to us, Barack and Michelle Obama are a symbol of progress, but y'all know we don't really know what's going on in the world. When I start talking to people about the devastating impact Obama's regime had on Africa through AFRICOM, the destruction of Libya, we don't know anything about that. So, if you want to know about that, if you really want to know the truth, if you want to hang on to your fantasies, then hang on to your fantasies. But if you really want to know the truth, then, I have articles like that. We have articles like that all the time that are really trying to make a sincere effort, you all, to inform you. The brain is a muscle, so, you have to be willing to exercise it, and we got information out there that's designed to do it. And that's the same with the last one. That hoodcommunist.org article is very wonderful. And so we'll go ahead, and I know we went on, and I just figured it'd be easier to just save it to the end if there's any comments. Shakur, did you notice anything we need to address?
I did. So Bobby said, Ajamu, thank you for these fantastic examples of guns as tools for liberation and history. What insights do you have into who Richard Okay was really working for? And then Kevin said, thank you for putting this webinar on, and thanks for your work on the African liberation. I enjoyed this and learned a bunch.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for raising that about Richard Ioki. If people don't know who Richard Ioki is, Richard Ioki was a young comrade, Japanese comrade, who lived in the Bay Area in the 60s, and evidently supplied some of the first weapons to Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale that the Black Panther Party had access to. He was the one that supplied them that. Now, and that was a lot of his role, and he participated and supported the Black Panther Party. There's disagreement depending upon who you talk to, whether he was an actual member of the Black Panther Party, and unfortunately, he's no longer with us as of 2009. But I think, based on what I have studied, that he certainly was a member of the Black Panther Party, even though he was one of our Japanese comrades. Now, there's another portion of that where there's a allegation that he was working as a police informant in some of those years. And there's even a theory that the understanding is that he took his own life in 2009. So there is a theory that he did that because of his shame at whatever it is he was felt compelled to share with the government. My take on it is that it's probably true, but to me, that still doesn't erase his contribution to the African liberation struggle that he had. And so, we thank him for that. And, I actually have the privilege of knowing there is a biography of him. I don't know the title, but if you type in Richard Ioki, A-O-K-I, it comes up. And the person who wrote that, Sister Diane, who's a Japanese comrade, is a friend of mine, and she lives in Central California. So she had the opportunity to research that and engage in numerous interviews with him. So I encourage you to read that and look at that. And yeah, that's a wonderful contribution that was made in spite of whatever else happened. And thank you for the other things. So I'm looking at Facebook. I don't see, we have, a lot of people on there. People are asking, there was a question about what the MPLA is. So I'll just clarify, that was the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola. It was the movement that brought independence to Angola in the 70s. And initially they engaged on a path of socialist development in Angola. But because of neoliberalism and neocolonialism, by the early 90s, they abandoned that path. And in order to qualify for International Monetary Fund, IMF, World Bank funds, which are imperialist controlled. And so they took that. And the problem with that, you all, is that when they were engaged in their revolutionary process in Angola, they were able to have a national political education campaign throughout the entire country to stop the practice of violent, forced castrations on women. And so they engaged in a mass political education campaign, the MPLA, the Popular Movement for Liberation of Angola, and they were able to reduce these castrations by 80%. But then when the IMF loans came in, what they do is they structure all the government funds to service their loans. So social services in every country in the world that has IMF loans are practically obliterated. And so after that happened in 1992, now today, female castrations, women castrations, that take place in Angola are up to the same percentage that they were pre-revolution. So this is really a sad development, but it speaks to why we need to destroy imperialism. No question about that. So look up these resources, and I want to encourage you, if you're on Facebook, send us a note. If you're interested in the AAPRP's work study process, which I went into good detail describing, let us know. We'll reach out to you. Doesn't matter where you are. We have virtual work study circles, and we can get you hooked up. We would love to do that. If you're not African, but you love the concept and you agree with it, we're willing to help you start work study groups. We've done that for a number of non-African groups, European groups. We help you develop work study groups. So just reach out. You can do that. If you want to talk to me directly about that, go to that abetterworld.me site and reach out. And we're happy to follow up with you and see how we can help you make that happen. But with that, is there anything else, Shakur, that you wanted to add?
No, thank you so much. There's no further comments.
Thank you so much, my daughter. So with that, we always like to end on time because we respect your time and we appreciate you coming to join us. Let people know we'll be back next Sunday with another topic. Shakur and I will work out what it'll be. And I'm trying to, as if you can tell, if you've been with us, have her more involved and me less involved, because she is just a wonderful person that way. So we'll do that and we'll let you know. So look for that. And we appreciate you. Enjoy, maintain your physical, mental, physical, and spiritual health. Stay strong, forward ever, backwards never. Always stay clever, ready for revolution.